Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start today's speaker series. I am very glad that we have Dr. Juan Carlos Belausteguigoitia with us today, this afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Belausteguigoitia, for joining us in today's presentation. I want to start this afternoon by thanking the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Embassy in particular, and the Study Abroad program that together with COMEXIS decided to organize this speaker series in order to provide a wider understanding of and deeper knowledge of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, and hopefully entice everyone to consider Mexico as a study abroad destination. This afternoon, we have with us, as I had mentioned, Dr. Juan Carlos Belausteguigoitia. He is professor at the economics, as an economics faculty of ITAM, the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, where he also is he's the head of the Center for Energy and Natural Resources. Dr. Belausteguigoitia has an undergraduate degree in economics at ITAM, and he's also a doctor in economy, in environmental economy by the Essex University. He is an expert in environmental economics. He has been a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley, Dartmouth College, and Queen Mary College of the University of London. He was the executive director of Centro Mario Molina and the coordinator for the Southern Hemisphere of the Global Waters International Assessment, as well as undersecretary of planning at Semarnap in Mexico. He was also the main environmental economist, or the head environmental economist at the Latin American region of the World Bank. We are very delighted to have Dr. Belausteguigoitia with us, as he is also a Fulbright-García Robles alum, and we are very happy that he will talk to us about the bilateral relation and all the environmental aspect of it. So thank you very much, Dr. Belausteguigoitia. You will have around 30 minutes for your presentation. After that, we will have questions from those attending. If you agree, I will read those questions and you can answer them. And please, for everyone attending, remember that at the bottom of your screen, you can find the question and answer feature where you can ask Dr. Belausteguigoitia any questions that you have. Welcome, Doctor. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you very much, Hazel, and thank you to all my friends at the American Embassy for this kind invitation. I'm only going to address a few environmental aspects of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relation, and mainly those related to trade environment and the institutional or the institutions that were created with the first and the second trade agreements, and then reflect on climate change and those institutions, and how the bilateral relation can be used to address in a more effective way climate change mitigation challenges in both countries. So if I may, I would like to share my screen. I have a presentation. Can you please enable the screen sharing function?
Yes, give us 1 minute, please, Doctor.
Sure. Okay, ready. Okay, as I said, only a few aspects of the environmental links between our two countries, and mainly those related to trade and later on climate change. This is the table of contents. I will mention briefly the importance of the socioeconomic impact, the importance of the environment, a brief mention of the history of US-Mexico environmental accords, then the two important trade agreements between the countries, well, and Canada, of course. Then I'll talk briefly about climate change, and I'll finalize with a few conclusions. Well, I guess that I could skip this, but I will very briefly mention the importance of the environment and environmental problems, especially in Mexico. Perhaps you don't, when I ask people about what the most important or how important environmental problems are and what they think is the most important environmental problem, even knowledgeable people, even well-educated people don't get the answers right. The environment is essential for the well-being of people, of nations, and for economic activity and economic growth. With regard to well-being and health, especially, but not exclusively. I mean, there are also links between the environment and human capital formation, for example. But with regard to health, unfortunately, there are close to 40,000 premature deaths in Mexico because of air pollution. People read every day about the violence toll in Mexico, but and of course that's a tragedy, and we should really be much more effective in fighting our security problems. But more people die from air pollution than from guns. That's the importance of air pollution, for example. Just to give you an idea, the INEGI, the Instituto Nacional de Estadística, Geografía y Historia, the National Office for Statistics, has estimated the environmental costs at around 10% of GDP a year. So that's huge, and that doesn't include all the costs, and the way in which they value statistical lives lost is very, very conservative. So environmental problems in Mexico are really, really, really important from an economic point of view, and not only from an efficiency point of view. I mean, our human capital formation, our economic growth could be much higher, but also from a fairness point of view. Most people that die from air pollution, most people that get sick from water pollution, most people that lose their livelihoods because of the degradation of ecosystems are poor people. So there is also a very important fairness dimension to this set of problems. Well, the threats come from unsustainable exploitation of nature, as I said, mismanagement and mispricing of assets. And this is really relevant, lack of collective action at local, national, and regional levels. We are conducting now a study that we hope will shed light on the reasons why, despite of all the information that people have, and despite of the tremendous costs that pollution and more generally environmental problems pose to people in Mexico, there is very, very little demand for effective and efficient environmental policies. And I will argue later on that the same is true at the regional North American level. There is a long history of environmental agreements between the US and Mexico. The first one dates back to the mid-19th century, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that focused mainly on the use of water along the border. You know, there are two important rivers, the Colorado and the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo in Mexico. As I said, since the mid-19th century, Mexico and the US have been collaborating in different ways to manage the flows of those two rivers. It was almost a century after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed that the water component was modernized in 1944. And later, almost 5 years ago, at the end of the 2017, the United States and Mexico signed a strengthened compact of the rules to allocate and to manage the waters of the two major rivers. You may know that the principle, if you are interested in water management issues, you should know that the main institution related to water management at the border is the International Boundary Waters Commission, which has offices in the two countries. Well, let me now jump to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the North American the North American Free Trade Agreement and the side agreement, the environmental side agreement, the North American Environmental Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. I guess that most of you were born in this century, but at the end of last century, in the early 1990s, Mexico and the US, President Salinas and President and President Bush Sr. Negotiated a free trade agreement. That free trade agreement didn't have any environmental considerations. At the end of 1992, President Clinton was elected, he insisted that in order for the US to sign the free trade agreement, two side agreements should accompany the trade agreement. An agreement on, or a side agreement on environment and a side agreement on labor issues. So, but these were side agreements. NAFTA, the main agreement and the main trade agreement was silent on environmental issues. And the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation had a very simple but very powerful basis, namely that each country was obliged to enforce its own environmental laws. This may seem not enough for all the environmental issues that could be aggravated by trade, or all the opportunities of environmental improvement that could arise because of the new trading relationship. But it has to be said that the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation was the first of its kind. There were no trade agreements that included, even aside agreements, trade and environment considerations. So this was very important at the time. For many environmentalists, insufficient, but all three countries were very, as I said, this was a first worldwide, were very afraid that that sovereignty could suffer because of a wider environmental agreement. So it was said that the main component of the economic cooperation agreements was that each country should enforce its own environmental laws. The environmental agreement also created the Commission for Environmental Cooperation and a process to file environmental complaints in the case for not only for governments, but also for individuals or NGOs that could ask for an investigation as to whether or not a country was not enforcing its own legislation with regard to a specific problem. The new trade agreement is different with regard to environmental organizations, with environmental issues. First and foremost, I mean, very, very importantly, the Environmental Cooperation Agreement was negotiated in parallel with the trade agreement. So it's an integral part, it's an essential part of the agreement, mainly in chapter 24. So both agreements, the Environmental Cooperation Agreement and the trade agreement, enter into force simultaneously. The new Environmental Cooperation Agreement replaced the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, but there was a continuity established by the Council of Environmental Cooperation, which was the big institution, the main institution that was charged with responsibility to promote cooperation and to look for the complaints that individuals or organizations could raise as to the lack of enforcement of environmental legislation. Chapter 24 of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement focuses on environmental issues, and it has procedures that include obligations related to several very important environmental problems. For example, to protect the ozone layer, to protect the marine environment. This was a very important addition. If you read the Article 24, you will see that there are large sections concerned with the marine environment. Of course, improving air quality is also part of chapter 24, preventing the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems. Also because in introduction of invasive species is mostly related to trade. There is also a chapter on that, or there's also a section on that. Again, marine species and forest management. And there is an important article on environmental cooperation that mandates the CEC to look for ways to strengthen environmental governments, to coordinate, to collaborate with countries to strengthen environmental governance, and to help countries look at, analyze environmental regulations that will reduce pollution and produce resilient economies. Despite this, well, then, as you can imagine, the environmental community was not very happy with the way in which the environment was included as a side issue in 1994. And despite the strengthening of environmental considerations in the new trade agreement, there is also a sense of in the environmental community of insufficiency, of lack of effective tools to address environmental problems related to trade. But I tend to be optimistic, and I think that the new agreement provides additional instruments that haven't been used to their full potential, and that again, widening the scope of the environmental content of the trade agreement was very, very difficult, because all three countries are very concerned about sovereignty issues. Well, an important, and here I have to concede the issue to other environmentalists. Another important concern is that climate change is not mentioned in the agreement. But again, I think that this has to do with sovereignty concerns. But as we will see, there are many ways in which, if we go back to the chapter 24 issues, that the environmental issues that chapter 24 encompasses, many of them can be used to address climate change issues. Protecting the ozone layer, of course, there are many climate change substances that are also related to the problem of the ozone layer, and preventing the loss of biodiversity, all the things that are related to forest management and forest sequestration are can be an important part of this trade agreement. The question is, why are emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, so pervasive, and why are policies to mitigate those emissions so difficult to implement? I'm an economist, and I think that the economic perspective goes a long way to understand why, despite all the evidence that climate change is such a serious problem, and that we do have the technologies and means to significantly reduce emissions. Why we haven't done that? And this goes not only for Mexico and the US, but also for most of the world. So the economic perspective, I think, is fundamental to gain to a complete understanding of the issues that will help us reduce in a cost-effective and in an effective way greenhouse gas emissions. Will help us also design solutions that are effective and economically sound, and understand the political positions of countries that, despite having the economic capacity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, have chosen not to do so. Well, you may be aware, I don't know how many of you are studying economics or have taken a course on economics, but the economic root cause of environmental problems is, or the root causes are the unintended side effects of consumers and firms, what we call externalities. I think that this vision is very important for several reasons. First, it's good to know that most pollution comes from desirable activities, consumption and production of goods and services. And that most of the time, these are side effects, and that it's a very inefficient way to, inefficient policy-wise, to look at environmental problems with a black and white glass. I mean, and by that I mean where you have bad people, those that pollute, and good people, those that suffer from the pollution. Most people and most firms contribute to pollution and suffer pollution. So it's as economists say, an unintended side effect of economic activity. Well, this is one, and this is very important to realize the importance of using economic instruments to address the economic root cause of, in this case, climate change. When consumers drive cars, or when firms produce steel or cement, they are externalizing part of the costs of their actions to other agents. So if you look at the problem in that way, the economic solution becomes readily apparent. And this was formalized in the second decade of the last century by a British economist, Cecil Pigou, the famous Pigouvian taxes in the case of negative externalities, or Pigouvian subsidies in the case of positive externalities. I'll return to this later on when we talk about effective policy instruments to control, to manage greenhouse gas emissions. But there is an additional economic aspect to climate change. It's not only externalities, but it's also the free rider problem. The atmosphere is a kind of global public good. That means that whether or not you contribute to reducing the emission of greenhouse gases, given that greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere, you will get, whether or not you contribute to reducing emissions, you will get most likely the same climate. Perhaps that's not true for China and the US, but even for those two countries, if they embark on a very ambitious climate policies and no other country does the same, then the problem will still be there. So it's this global good nature of the atmosphere that also complicates the problem. And this can be seen by the fact that for practically any country, the cost that a country has to shoulder when the country implements mitigation policies are, and I'm sure in any case, much higher than the benefits that this country could get from its own reductions in emissions. So that's a big problem. And there is an additional problem, and this has to do with, well, the previous one also has to do with the political economy, but especially this one. The damage function of greenhouse gases, or the damages are a function of stocks, i.e. of accumulated greenhouse gases, not from the flow of greenhouse gases. So this means that the long-term, the important consequences will be felt in the long term. I mean, we know that if we continue emitting greenhouse gases with a business as usual scenario, we may get a world with with a temperature increase of 3 to 4 degrees, and that in 2060 to 2070, and that will be very difficult, well, catastrophic, not only difficult to deal with, but catastrophic. So the most important consequences are long-term, whereas if we want to reduce emissions, the costs are short-term. There are many important co-benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but nonetheless, there are very important costs, and that explains why, for example, neither the US nor Mexico have meaningful national carbon pricing policies. There are several states in the US and even regions that have introduced carbon pricing policies, but there is no, as you know, there's no national policy. And there are very important policies with regard to research and development, but those policies do not really address the externalities problems, the main economic cause of climate change. And when you consider this fact that costs are short-term and the important benefits are long-term, you realize that this is a political nightmare for political decision making, for political decision makers, for policy, for politicians, because they usually look just for the opposite: short-term benefits and long-term costs that they could push for other generations or other people to shoulder. So international cooperation is essential to overcome both problems. A partial conclusion of this is that the effective management of climate change is a political economic challenge that is extremely difficult to address due to its public good nature, coupled with the intertemporal asymmetry of costs and benefits. Let's look at the carbon mitigation policy instruments that the policymaker has at his disposal. You may, again, I don't know if you have analyzed this in your economics courses, but economists and most policy analysts are strong advocates of carbon pricing instruments, because again, in order to come up with meaningful reductions, when you look at all the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, you realize that you have to come up with really substantial changes in behavioral changes in the way consumers act and in the way firms produce goods and services. And this can only come from pricing signals. Of course, and this is the third bullet, pricing signals are not enough. Many economists have long said that this is not the case, that i.e. that you just have to price carbon emissions correctly. But we know that due to other market failures, I mean, not only externalities and public goods, pricing instruments have to be complemented with other instruments such as R&D subsidies, efficiency standards for buildings, for example, and infrastructure investment. The market failures and the changes are so enormous that even well-designed pricing policies will not do the trick. Let me concentrate on because I will come back to relate this to the trade agreement. Let me look at the two ways to price carbon emissions explicitly. Of course, any regulation puts a price on carbon emissions. If you put a standard, emitting carbon is going to be, carbon dioxide is going to be more expensive. But there are two ways to price carbon emissions explicitly. These are taxes, a tax on CO2 emissions, and tradable emission permits, cap and trade. Both of these two instruments have been compared using many criteria to try to rank one above the other. Some of those criteria are responsiveness to economic to changes, for example, economic growth. If you put a tax and new firms come in to the market, perhaps that tax is no longer going to be enough to get emissions to the targeted level. Inflation, if you put a tax and there's inflation and you don't change the tax according to inflation, obviously emissions are going to increase. Technological change and many other changes are important to consider when designing an environmental policy instrument. The distributional impact, taxes on emissions may impact lower income levels. The effectiveness of taxes vis-a-vis tradable emission permits, that's a very important literature, and the conclusion is that when you care in the face of uncertainty, if you are not sure, if the policy makers really are certain as to the forms of the relevant functions to design taxes and tradable permit systems, namely the marginal costs of firms and the marginal benefits of reducing emissions, then if you care more about reaching the environmental goal, i.e. if there are, for example, scenarios in which if you don't reach the environmental goal, then you will trigger a huge environmental effect. But if there are no such scenarios, if environmental costs are smooth, in a way smooth, then and if you care more about costs of achieving certain reductions, then taxes are preferable. But if you do have those non-smooth environmental damage, marginal environmental damage functions, then you would prefer cap and trade, tradable emission permits. And from a political economy point of view, Professor Stevens, professor at Harvard, has mentioned that he's a fierce advocate of cap and trade instruments, or cap and trade based instruments. He says that taxes have that lobbying with regard to taxes have an impact on the effectiveness, on the environmental effectiveness of the instrument, whereas lobbying in the cap and trade system only has distributional impacts, but not environmental effectiveness impacts. So that's a way to look at it. But again, the fact remains that whether in the form of tradable permits or taxes, we need much more effective and cost-effective instruments to address climate change in the North American countries. And I would like to argue that as mitigation costs increase and the mitigation efforts are deemed insufficient, politicians will be more likely to consider pricing instruments. And this as a result of changing preferences of the population. And there may be, perhaps not in the near future, but in, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, there may be room for a tradable permit system for North America. And this will really provide the incentives, but also making it a North American system will also provide cost mitigation space for the emitters in our region. So I'm pretty sure that just like California has joined efforts with Ontario, that in the perhaps not the near future, but the medium to long-term future, we will see a North American effort to either introduce a tradable permit, a regional tradable permit system, or some kind of minimum carbon price to coordinate actions. And there is also a more aggressive, the tax and the cap and trade system are more cooperation oriented, but there is also another instrument that uses pricing signals to induce a more ambitious climate change mitigation policy, namely the border tax adjustment. If the United States and Canada think that Mexico doesn't have an ambitious enough climate change policy, they may introduce taxes to compensate the advantage of Mexican firms because they do not have to spend on mitigating carbon emissions, and then this tax adjustment may be used. This, by the way, this border tax adjustment is already designed, has already been designed by the European authorities, by the European Union authorities, and there is a lot of talk about this border tax adjustment in the US and Canada. Pricing policies are not strange to find. There are many carbon pricing initiatives, both at the national and subnational levels. There are close to this was taken from a World Bank publication of 2020. So at the moment, there are more than 60 national pricing schemes, carbon pricing schemes, and close to 50 subnational carbon pricing schemes that cover almost a quarter of global CO2 equivalent emissions. So I'm pretty sure, as I said, that as climate change becomes more of a problem and mitigation policies become more expensive, international efforts, joining international trade, cap and trade agreements will be a more feasible solution. This is a map of all the tax and cap and trade systems that have that are being implemented today, as of today. And there are other important mechanisms that are not necessarily compulsory regulations, but the financial system and financial regulators have come up with disclosure schemes, with climate-related disclosure schemes, and these have been introduced voluntarily by many firms, and are being introduced now by several. As part of compulsory disclosure regulations in many jurisdictions. The most famous one, perhaps, is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which are the basis of a new set of proposed standards that was released about a month ago, that will standardize. I said that the TCFD was perhaps the most famous methodology to disclose information on climate change, but now there is an effort by the International Sustainability Standards Board to standardize this, using the TCFD recommendations, to standardize the way in which firms disclose their environmental risks and opportunities. So this is forcing firms to come up with disclosure instruments. Sorry. The Task Force for Climate Financial Related Disclosures has this 4 recommendations, and one of those recommendations looks at metrics and instruments to disclose information on climate-related risk. And one of those metrics has to do with the emissions, not only of the firm, but also of the firms that provide inputs to that firm. And that's why I'm absolutely sure that sooner or later, Mexico and other countries will realize that it's not only a matter of firms disclosing their information, but they will also disclose the way in which they produce the emissions produced to produce the inputs for specific products. And the most important input in many cases is electricity, or in general, energy. And that's why, despite all the setbacks that Mexico and other countries have been having with regard to the introduction of cleaner energy and cleaner production in general, I'm sure that the economic reality and market forces will force countries like Mexico to consider more ambitious climate-related policies. Well, I had many other issues to discuss, but when I put all this together, I realized that it was going to take me a lot of time. So perhaps this is where I should stop and perhaps just conclude that we have strengthened environmental institutions related to trade and related to environmental problems in general, regional environmental problems in general, but we still have a lot to do. And in particular, in taking advantage of what we have, we could, of course, be much more aggressive in designing and introducing new instruments, but this is at present not politically possible, but there's a lot we can do with what we have. And with regard to climate change, even though our current agreement doesn't include climate change, there are many things that can be used from that trade agreement that can address climate change problems. And in the future, I'm pretty sure that we will have a very effective regional instrument, either in the form of a cap and trade system or of a minimum price of carbon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Belausteguigoitia. Okay.
I think I took much more time than you allocated to me.
A little bit more, but don't worry. We have 3 questions. If you don't mind, I will read the 3 of them, and maybe you can answer.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So Elias Plata is asking, how does a binational cooperation has influenced forest governance in Mexico?
Can you repeat that, Hazel? Because I didn't get that.
How does the binational cooperation has influenced forest governance in Mexico? Forest from bosques. And what is the direction you believe that this forest governance will take in the near future?
Well, this is one very important aspect. You can reduce climate change pressures either by mitigating emissions or by capturing carbon emissions, and forests are perhaps the best way to do that. Unfortunately, Mexico has not taken advantage of that potential, the carbon capture potential. Many cap and trade systems have offsets instruments. That means that the systems open the possibility for firms that are regulated in that system to buy offsets in regions that are not regulated by that cap and trade system. But of course, those offsets have to comply with certain characteristics, because otherwise the cap and trade authorities are not sure, will not be certain as to the real capacity and the real capture of those instruments. So Mexico, and for this, the reporting, monitoring, and verification is very important, and Mexico doesn't have a good system to guarantee firms that are interested in offsetting their emissions with forest mitigation services in Mexico. They cannot guarantee that. So it's a big institutional failure that I hope that the Mexican government and Mexican authorities will address in the near future.
Thank you, Doctor. Grace Mafucci is asking, what do you think is the most helpful or important thing a U.S. student can do as a Fulbrighter in Mexico? in terms of combating climate change and supporting a healthy environment?
I had other, well, part of my presentation was to show you all the courses and exchange programs that we have. I mean, there are many, it depends on your interests. What was the name of the student that asked this?
Grace Mafuch.
Grace, it depends on your interest. If you are an economist, you can study all the things that I discussed. This, if you are an engineer, you can look at the technological innovations. If you are a political scientist, you can look at why citizens don't demand effective environmental or in general, or climate change in particular actions. I mean, there are many ways. Climate change is a multidimensional problem, and you can contribute to its solutions in many ways. And in Mexico, we have good institutions, good academic institutions where you can study all those aspects, not only economic aspects at ITAM, but in engineering aspects, political science aspects, international relations aspects. I'll be very glad to talk to Hazel or to Araceli if you tell me what your area of interest is, a good academic exchange program for you to visit Mexico.
Thank you, Doctor. And then we have a third question, and the third question says, you discussed how environmental problems such as air and water quality are issues not only of health and economics, but of fairness, as most of those who suffer due to these issues are low income. Has the Mexican government taken action on those challenges of environmental justice in a class-conscious manner?
No, I'm sorry to say that, but it hasn't. It hasn't. If you look at the number of premature deaths, it continues rising. If you look at the measures that they have introduced to use much more polluting fuels to generate electricity, and again, the people that will suffer that are low-income people. I'm sorry to say, but it's not clear to me that environmental fairness is an important policy objective of the Mexican government, and it should.
Okay. Well, Dr. Belausteguigoitia, these are the questions that we have, and we are very glad that you could join us this afternoon and shared with us all of this very important and interesting information on a very pressing topic. I think one of the things that you said at the beginning of how many people are dying because of air pollution compared to those that are dying by guns is very impactful and should really have us thinking what we can do to really change the situation. So again, we are very, very grateful that you shared this afternoon with us your knowledge, and we want to thank all you and all of those that were present today.
Thank you for the invitation, and if anyone has other questions, you have my email address, and I'll be very glad to answer. And do come to Mexico. I mean, we do have problems, but we can provide you with a good learning experience and the appropriate atmosphere so that you concentrate on your learning experience.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes, please come and consider Mexico as a study destination, and to continue exploring new topics. We hope you all connect next Wednesday.
Wednesday or Tuesday?
No, our next
is Wednesday. Okay.
Is on Wednesday at 4 p.m. I think we will explore human rights.
Oh, very good.
Yes. Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much.
Doctor. Good afternoon.
Thank you for the invitation.
Everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.